This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 205 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest today is Dr. Luca Trenta. Luca is an associate professor in international relations at Swansea University in Wales and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Higher Education Academy. He's written extensively on covert action and assassination as tools of foreign policy. He's the host of the Out of the Shadows podcast with 9 episodes available now, and he has appeared on 4 episodes of the Secret Wars Uncovered series on the History Channel. This is Luca's second appearance on the podcast. He was here last year for episode number 150 when we discussed his newly published book, The President's Kill List. Today, he's back to discuss his research into the effects of covert action on the relationship between the U.S. executive and legislative branches, specifically as it applies to Operation PBSUCCESS, the overthrow of the Guatemalan government in 1954. PBSUCCESS took place during what could be called the Golden Age of intelligence operations, which also coincided with very little formal oversight by Congress. Luca and his co-authors published their findings in 2023 in the Journal of Intelligence and National Security in an article titled Secrecy and the Politics of Selective Disclosures, the U.S. Government's Intervention in Guatemala. By the way, if you're looking for a new way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm already enjoying my own subscription because it's opened my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code JUSTIN10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Luca, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you and great to be here.
I appreciate it. I've always been fascinated by PBSUCCESS, as you and I were discussing earlier, and I'm really happy for a chance to talk about it with you now in detail.
Absolutely, yeah.
So one thing that stood out to me about your paper was you mentioned how so much of these selective disclosures, as we'll get into, kind of relied on this informal process. It seemed like a lot of it was just like conversations in the halls of Congress and that sort of thing. So did that make it difficult for you to sort of piece together so long after the fact?
Yes, it was quite difficult. In a sense, it was a combination of having too much material on certain things, because as you probably know, and your listeners know for sure, PBSUCCESS is one of the most researched covert operations of the Cold War, probably, I guess, together with the Bay of Pigs. So you have plenty of primary sources and plenty of secondary sources. But at the same time, we had very, very little that would show us the connections between sort of the executive branch being State Department, CIA, and the White House, and Congress or leading members of the media. And in part, this was because a positive effort was made at the end of PBSUCCESS to destroy both official documents and documents from the personal collections of the people involved. So researching the topic really entailed searching every possible archive available, including several personal papers collections of leading members of Congress at the time, and trying to put together a puzzle. I think Barrett, a historian who's also looked at this, calls it the glimpses of a hidden history. And I think this really captures what it is to try and research this type of topic.
Yeah, I can certainly believe it. And I'm always amazed at the lengths that so many of my guests have to go to just to publish a fairly complete overview of almost any of these events, because there were so many efforts to obscure them or destroy the evidence and all that for so many years beforehand. So, I'm very impressed with what you've been able to put together, you and your co-authors here, and I'm excited to talk about this. One thing that really kind of surprised me was that, I don't know if I should say surprised, but it was good to see it anyway, is that you write about how hiding things for, the agency and the intelligence community, for them to hide things from the domestic constituencies as well as the adversaries, that was equally important. Can you talk about why hiding things from these domestic constituencies is so important?
Yes, absolutely. I think this goes to the very origin of the project. I've become involved in a research network that I would strongly recommend again to your listeners called the Secrecy, Power, and Ignorance Research Network. They're based out of Bristol and led by a great scholar, Elspeth van Vieren. They have a website, they do encyclopedias and all sorts of interesting projects. And through them, I had become more aware or more involved in scholarship on secrecy. And it seemed that the bulk of the scholarship looked at how secrecy has primarily a function at the international level that we might go into a discussion of it, in the sense that a state decides to operate secretly in an effort to manage escalation. So if you operate, you can imagine if you operate secretly in another country, the country on the receiving end basically has a decision to make whether they want to expose your secret intervention or whether they want to collude with you and operate behind the scenes, operate covertly. This was the argument that Austin Carson made in a very good book, I think called Covert Wars, if I'm not mistaken. But the focus there was primarily on the international stage, so to say. And then I was reading a book because actually I wanted to refresh my memory exactly on PB success for a lecture in my class. And I was reading a book by Callanan on covert operations in the early Cold War. And he had quite a couple of paragraphs in which he says that PB success was very much geared also towards domestic constituencies, and in particular to show to Republicans in Congress that the administration could take a very strong anti-communist action even at the time of McCarthyism. So basically, you did not need to support McCarthy to be anti-communist. And that sort of made me think, in a sense, that, well, it must mean then that acting covertly also has an influence on domestic constituencies, not only on the international sphere or on international partners and so on. And that really was the start of the project. And we identified, and we might discuss them later on, a couple of dynamics that explain how domestic constituencies become relevant when states decide to operate covertly and to disclose certain information.
Yeah, certainly. I would love to dive into that more. You used a term that I was not familiar with in the paper. Can you talk about what you mean by the signaling function of secrecy?
Yes, I'm not entirely sure it is solely my term. I think scholarship on secrecy in general talks about how, again, acting covertly is done to send a signal to the main adversary. For example, we can imagine a situation in which we have very dovish domestic constituencies that prevent, for example, an administration to conducting an overt military operation. If the same administration instead operates covertly, it can send a signal to the adversary that they are willing to take more risks than the one that the dovish domestic constituencies would permit. This is, again, an argument made by Carson and his co-authors. And at the same time, if you're acting secretly, you might want to communicate to your adversary, so to send a signal to your adversary that, look, we have a very hawkish, in this case, domestic constituency. So if we keep this secret or covert, we might prevent the risk of potential escalation.
I have to admit that is not something I had considered at all, and it makes perfect sense to me when you put it that way, and it just gone right over my head, quite frankly, in all the reading I've done. But my initial thought would have been that governments would always want to expose covert action by their adversary, and of course that has happened in many cases. But I guess in some ways they have a vested interest in keeping covert action covert, even if they are the victims of it. In a sense, that's quite incredible, I have to admit.
Yeah, this is the argument made by Carson, in the sense that sometimes it pays to operate behind the scenes because you do not want to run the risk of exposing the intervention by your adversaries, potentially creating the risk of a broader escalation that becomes either overt or military and so on. So we build basically on this scholarship. And to a certain extent, we challenge it to suggest that maybe it's not secrecy that permits to achieve these objectives, but is decisions done by the executive to disclose certain information in a certain manners.
I see. So would you say then that that right from the start, right from the early 1950s, was the public opinion, like the U.S. citizenry public opinion, was that being factored into all of these decisions on covert action by Central Intelligence Agency and Congress?
I mean, I'm not sure if in all decisions regarding intelligence and covert operations, certainly we have evidence that there was very much a concern surrounding PB success regarding both the potential reactions of Congress and of public opinion. In a sense, there was almost the administration's effort to galvanize Congress and galvanize public opinion and to raise the alarm about the danger posed by Guatemala was almost too successful. At one point, the administration came to feel the pressure by public opinion and by Congress to do more. So, in a sense, it was certainly factored in, and there is some evidence that it might have even taken the administration to more aggressive and, one should say, more controversial measures that we might get into as we discuss the operation.
Sure, understandable. And you mentioned quite a bit, well, kind of a central theme really of the paper is selective disclosures, specifically, or mostly anyway, to Congress. So what is the purpose? When the CIA, in my mind, if they go to Congress for anything, it's because they need some sort of concrete support, like whether it's funding or, something like that. But that's not the only purpose of these selective disclosures. So can you talk about how those were kind of wielded through the course of PB Success before, during, and after?
Yeah, absolutely. So we try to distinguish selective disclosures from other, cases. For example, the use of leaks. Leaks we generally understand as something that is done with the intention of the information going public, and most often to undermine either the policy chosen by the administration or to undermine some bureaucratic adversary. When we talk about selective disclosures, we refer to the disclosure of some information that was previously only in the hands of people within the executive to outsiders, which, as you said, can be leading members of Congress or leading figures in the media. And it is selective both in terms of the content of what is disclosed, but also selective in a sense that it is provided only to a certain group of trusted individuals. So trusted journalists, for example, at the time, or leading figures in Congress. Of course, we have to remember that this happens at a time in which there is a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy, a bipartisan and aggressive anti-communism, and a high degree, in most cases, of trust between the media and the executive, between the media and the White House, for example, but also a great availability on the part of the media to follow the White House line, whether it comes to self-censoring or really accepting White House pressure to censor certain journalists.
Understood. Okay. So you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned leaks and how they're different than selective disclosures, but you also talk about these disclosures to the media. So what is the difference between a leak to the media and a selective disclosure to the media?
I think the difference there is the extent to which the information is reproduced in its entirety or it goes public. So, for example, you asked me earlier, and I think I forgot to answer, what do we find are the purposes of these selective disclosures? And we find two main purposes of these selective disclosures. One is to raise alarm, raise awareness initially, and then raise alarm about, in this case, the alleged threat posed by Guatemala and Jacobo Arbenz. And the second function, which is somewhat contradictory to the first one, is actually to pacify, to moderate the claims of hawkish domestic constituencies and reassure them that the executive is doing something regarding a certain issue, in this case, again, Guatemala, so that their claims or their willingness to investigate the topic don't actually obstruct the conduct of a covert operation.
Okay. So prior to PB Success actually beginning, was Dulles and was the CIA, did they have a positive relationship with Congress? Did they kind of get what they wanted to begin with, or was it a little bit more complicated than that?
I think there has long been a conventional wisdom that Congress was not involved at all in oversight of the CIA or in constraining the CIA in the early days of the Cold War. I think that conventional wisdom has been challenged in recent years by various scholars, including in our work. And there is the suggestion that actually, while oversight was much more informal and perhaps conducted in various committees and then in one-to-one meetings between members of the executive and leading members of Congress, some degree of oversight did happen. And I think it would be an oversimplification to say that at the time, the CIA was always getting what it wanted, whether in terms of support or in terms of money. For example, in the early years of the Eisenhower administration, we see a reduction in the budget of the CIA. But it is fair to say that it was certainly a non-confrontational approach. Congress tended to trust the executive and trust the CIA. And actually, in those occasions in which you had early calls for a joint committee that would oversee the CIA, for example, Mike Mansfield in Congress does try a couple of times to establish something that is much closer to the committees that we have today. Those suggestions, those recommendations are put to one side, surprisingly not so much by the CIA, but by Congress, that is more than happy with how the less formal system at the time is actually working.
Okay. I see. So, yeah, just a far cry from today is kind of what I'm hearing, honestly.
Well, I couldn't possibly say.
Oh, goodness. So, going back to Guatemala specifically, when and why did CIA actually become interested in what was happening there? Because you've already said, I think twice you've said, the threat from Guatemala, and that's just not, I don't really think of threats as emanating from Guatemala typically. So what was the focus there in the early 1950s?
So I think here we have to mention that the US had a well-established relation with Guatemala already in the 1940s at the time of the dictatorship of Jorge Ubico. And this relationship was largely driven by one should say, enormous role played by the United Fruit Corporation in Guatemala and in Central America more broadly. I think some excellent research that came out around the time of our article by scholars called Marshall and another scholar called Moulton has shown, this came out in Diplomatic History, has shown really the extensive influence that the United Fruit Corporation had, not only on members of the Eisenhower administration, which is something that has been well known for decades, really, but even earlier than that, in influencing also the Truman administration, as well as leading members of Congress in taking a certain posture when it came to issues like Guatemala, like the reputation of the United Fruit, like land reform, that would become very prominent after the elections of Jacobo Arbenz. When it comes to the CIA becoming interested in Guatemala, as I'm sure you'll know, there is an earlier operation in which the CIA is involved. I wouldn't say that the CIA is the leading force there. It's an operation called the PB Fortune. And PB Fortune largely, as far as we can tell, comes from an initiative of the Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza. Somoza basically tells the United States, if you give me a few weapons, I'll rid you of the threat of communism in Guatemala. And the United States government becomes interested, the CIA becomes interested, and they try to get together with not only Nicaragua, but also Venezuela and Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, and try to launch an operation that would overthrow the Arbenz government. I think the support of the US government and of the CIA is really limited. As far as we can tell, it basically amounts to retrofitting a naval vessel that can be used for the transport of weapons. And there are various, and the sale of these weapons, which I think depart, if I'm not mistaken, from New Orleans. There are a couple of theories as to how the PB Fortune fails or crumbles. In one theory, a State Department official is asked to sign a document about this transfer of weapons, and he basically was not aware that this was going on, and he tells Secretary of State Acheson at the time, and basically Acheson convinces Truman to cancel the whole thing. In another version of events, it has to do with the fact that Somoza, the Nicaraguan dictator, had been too I don't know, indiscreet and was talking about this big operation that was coming. And so plausible deniability had gone out of the window. And so the operation basically sort of was canceled. But this is really the precursor to PBSUCCESS and the early involvement of the CIA. And some of the same characters that we would encounter later on, for example, Castillo Armas is already involved in PB Fortune. But this is really the early CIA interest and involvement.
Okay, I see. So that one just never really got off the ground at all. If the weapons were never even shipped, then is that correct?
I think one story suggests that the weapons were basically they had been shipped. They had left New Orleans and they were diverted. Now I can't remember. I think they were diverted to the Dominican Republic or somewhere else, but they never reached Guatemala. Basically.
Okay, so that plan fell out, but the objectives remained and the motivations remained among the players then.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, it's quite interesting to see that when Allen Dulles, who was, of course, already in the CIA under Truman, becomes CIA director, and they review the documents and what had been done under PB Fortune, they basically realize that they will need a much broader effort and a much broader political effort, even domestically and internationally, if something like this was to go forward again.
Okay, I see. You mentioned United Fruit Company a few minutes ago. Was this mostly driven by their kind of like land holdings in the country and their influence over U.S. government, or were there other concerns aside from that?
I mean, this has been, I think, for a very long time, the million-dollar question regarding PBSUCCESS. Was it driven by anti-communism or the perceived communism of Arbenz and his government, or was it driven by materialistic financial interest of the people surrounding Eisenhower and a willingness to protect the holdings, the interest and reputation of the United Fruit Company? I think the answer really is both. And to a certain extent, the United Fruit Company had such a major influence on how Congress and how the administration perceived Guatemala in general and the Arbenz government in particular, that it's really difficult to disentangle the two. Like by the time Eisenhower is approving Operation PBSUCCESS in August, United Fruit Company has spent years and years launching a propaganda campaign, trying to defend its operations in Guatemala, trying to portray everything that Arbenz does as communism and convincing congressmen to be at the very forefront of this propaganda and rhetorical campaign.
Okay, I see. And so what was the threat to United Fruit as they saw? I mean, Arbenz, if I recall correctly, he was planning to, or he had already seized some of their land, and they had like millions of acres in the country. Is that right?
Well, the main threat was what was called Decree 900, which was a land reform decided by the Arbenz government, which, of course, because the United Fruit was so dominant in the region, ended up. We have to remember that United Fruit is generally associated simply with bananas and fruit and so on. But they had extensive holdings even in railroads, telephones, the electrical system in the country, so much so that they were known in the country as El Pulpo, meaning the octopus, because they had tentacles everywhere. And we should also remember that they basically kept a system in the countries and in their lands of basically racial segregation and almost slavery conditions for the workers. So the Arbenz government decided on an agrarian land reform in a situation in which in Guatemala, 2% of the Guatemala landowners owned 72% of the land. So the agrarian reform was very much needed. I know I sounded a bit like a Bernie Sanders there with the 2% and the 72%. But what I think is quite ironic, and there are many of these ironies in many covert operations, is basically that the land reform suggested in Decree 900 is very similar to the land reforms that would be recommended for Latin America in a few years under the Alliance for Progress of the Kennedy administration. So we're not talking about a socialistic land reform here. But of course, it had a very negative influence on the United Fruit, also because the Guatemalan government was willing to compensate the United Fruit, but only recognizing the price of the land based on the tax returns of the company. So the company had a very conservative, shall we say, tax returns, and the Guatemalan government wanted to recognize only that value of the land.
Oh, wow.
And so, of course, this created a major friction between the company and its supporters in Washington and the Arbenz government.
Yeah, I can see how they would feel caught between a rock and a hard place there with the valuation based on their tax returns, as most companies probably would, I have to admit. Wow. Okay. So PB Fortune, as you mentioned, was basically just, was, I don't know if I'd say maybe a light touch, but, driven by the neighbors there. How did the intent and in a way behind PB Success, how did that differ? That was much more interventionist, I guess. Wasn't it like an active hand?
Absolutely, yes. It was much more robust, both in terms, as we said earlier, of creating the groundwork in Washington and in Congress and in the media. But I guess the major difference was the higher involvement in terms of training of a paramilitary force and providing this paramilitary force with a small but significant air force. And I guess the bigger element of the whole operation was certainly what was called at the time the nerve war, meaning the propaganda war, based both on targeting specific individuals, but also with a broader messaging, both by the United States Information Agency and primarily by the CIA and the famous or infamous, depending on your taste, David Atlee Phillips and the so-called Voice of Liberation, the radio that pretended to be in Guatemala when it sort of actually wasn't. And it was bombarding Guatemala with messaging surrounding the operation, and especially when the paramilitary invasion, I guess in inverted commas, starts, it makes this invasion appear like a much bigger deal than it actually is.
Right. If I recall correctly from your paper and elsewhere, I think the invasion was like fewer than 100 men, wasn't it? Something like that?
I think the invasion was a few hundred, if I'm not mistaken,
Okay.
but I could be mistaken. But I guess the main point is that these were led by Castillo Armas,
right?
But the paramilitary invasion sort of fails almost immediately, and in one case, I think it fails even before starting, because if I'm not mistaken, a component of the invasion of these groups of, let's say, paramilitary group is arrested even in El Salvador, so even before crossing the border.
Oh, wow. Yeah, inauspicious start there, certainly. So prior to the actual invasion, we should probably back up a tiny bit, really, but how did the CIA either develop or maybe I would say manipulate support within the legislative branch? Like, were there key Congress members who actually knew what the plan was, or did they perhaps think that they knew what the plan was?
This is a bit tricky. I think we might come to it again later. I think there was certainly an effort by the administration which worked really hand in hand. We have to recall that I guess John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, his brother, was CIA director. So they tended to work really hand in hand on this, in convincing various leading congressmen to raise the issue of Guatemala, raise the threat of Guatemala. In this, of course, the propaganda hand of the United Fruit was also very much present, and we can see in the personal papers of several congressmen, like, for example, Alexander Wiley, how much of what they actually said in Congress was relying on information provided by the United Fruit, and eventually turned into a pamphlet with funds of the United Fruit. And at the same time, the CIA was doing something very similar. It was providing notes for speeches of congressmen. And these notes often portrayed the situation in Guatemala in the most apocalyptic tones, like a major Kremlin conspiracy going on at the time. And this information was repeated by various members of Congress in speeches and in committees and so on. And I guess even before the invasion, the two leading events are the Organization of American States Conference in Caracas, where, again, from the record, we can ascertain that some briefings by the CIA did happen with leading members of Congress. And the second main event certainly is the so-called ALFHEM. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. ALFHEM incident. This is the purchase by Guatemala of weapons from the Czech Republic, and there was a boat that traveled all the way to Guatemala. It was able to circumvent a sort of blockade that the United States had imposed on Guatemala, and the cargo of weapons was also able to escape some sabotage efforts by CIA assets, PBSUCCESS assets in the country. The weapons really were like a nothing burger, to use a recent term. The weapons were probably too old to be used in any potential confrontation. And really, they were a consequence of the fact that all the Guatemalan neighbors had been threatening Guatemala, and the United States had refused, for obvious reasons, I guess, to sell weapons to the government. But they really caused a sort of hysteria in Congress with some incredible claims like the suggestion that these weapons landing in Guatemala were the same thing of an atomic weapon placed in U.S. territory, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But they really became a topic of discussion, controversy, and fanciful claims. And they also exposed really some of the risks that this effort by the executive to raise alarm surrounding Guatemala could then pose to the U.S. government position actually in Guatemala, because quite a few congressmen after this transfer of weapons wanted to investigate what was going on in Guatemala and wanted to have trips to the region. But of course, at the time, PBSUCCESS was already very much underway, at least in its preparation stage. So of course, any trip to the region would have been detrimental to the covert operation. And at the same time, you have calls by leading congressmen to basically withdraw U.S. military bases in the countries and in Guatemala and U.S. military support to Guatemala, because the argument is if these people are fully supportive of the Arbenz government, of course they are communists, so why should we support them? And this becomes an explicit call in Congress until basically the Dulles brothers, as far as we can tell, call some of these congressmen aside and say, look, there might be something happening down there for which we might need our people to be on the ground. So basically the bases are staying and don't mention it again. And this sort of rapidly disappears from the discussion. So there is a series of events that really showcase how selective disclosures can help in raising alarm, but then you also need them again to try and moderate those constituencies that you have basically catalyzed to make a big deal out of Guatemala, and then that you eventually need to keep quiet.
Okay, I see. I was very surprised to learn that there were U.S. troops in country when all this began. Was this just like a couple of small training detachments or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were, I guess, probably not really equipped to like take over the capital or anything like that.
No. They were small military bases, I would assume, training posts. And the concern was, why are we training the Guatemalan army if the Guatemalan army is supporting the government? I guess.
Yeah, that's a compelling argument. I have to admit, they make a good point there, understandably. You did write something that I was also not aware of. There was this, I guess you could call him like a pesky New York Times reporter who started writing that things were not as they seemed. Can you talk a little bit about that and how the CIA kind of counteracted that reporting?
Yeah, that is very interesting. Is Sidney Gruson, which is a New York Times reporter, earlier I think it was at the early start of the Eisenhower administration, Gruson had been reporting on Guatemala and eventually from Guatemala. But he had been initially very much following the line of the administration of the United Fruit, that the government was communist, it was a threat. So much so that he had been expelled by the Guatemalan government with 3 other US citizens, which of course had been taken as evidence by the United States that the government was a totalitarian regime that would expel citizens of other countries and so on. Eventually, Gruson is able to make his way back to the country, and he starts writing articles that they aren't really pro-Guatemala. They are simply suggesting that maybe the government, the Arbenz government, is not really communist, is more nationalist than anything else. And he also makes some references, although never mentioning actually that it was CIA assets, that some sabotage attempt had happened while the weapons cargo was traveling around the country. And I think it's this type of information that really makes Allen Dulles angry. And he has, I think, a luncheon with the editor of the New York Times at the time, in which he basically tells him that Sidney Gruson should no longer report from Guatemala and certainly on Guatemala. And Gruson will discover this only later on in the 70s, that he had been kept away from Guatemala from not basically to reduce the risk that he might unveil the full details of PBSUCCESS, or that he might be reporting on what was going on at the time. But this is quite interesting because at the same time, you had other journalists that were sort of in a different position. James Reston of the New York Times writes an article almost as PBSUCCESS is underway, in which he makes clear that Allen Dulles is involved in this thing, whereas you have other journalists that see their work completely rewritten once it gets to the United States to make it more supportive of the US government. I think journalist Ivan Thomas has mentioned how Time magazine journalists saw their pieces completely rewritten once they got to the United States to be more supportive of the government.
Wow, that makes sense. When I've gone back through, actually, since you mentioned Time magazine, I love the Time Vault on their website. And when I go back and I look at reporting from the 50s, it's the most lopsided stuff imaginable in so many cases. And it makes me wonder, is that the reporter? Is it the editor? Or is it, some other third party there? Because this stuff can't be as clear cut as they're making it out to be, when it was initially written and printed anyway.
Yeah.
Amazing. And, for Gruson, I have to admit, it makes me laugh because when you're reporting on a brewing conflict and both of the countries involved in that conflict want you as far away as possible, then you're probably a pretty talented reporter, I have to admit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think
good for him.
Initially was kicked out by one country because it was too supportive of the other, and then eventually is understood to be too supportive of the first country around. And yeah, he's probably getting close to the truth at this point, it sounds like. Yeah.
Wow, amazing stuff. So as PBSUCCESS developed, you mentioned that one of the guys was arrested in El Salvador, but did they generally keep a lid on most of this covert action before it actually began, or was it kind of well known locally at least?
It's not a guy that is arrested. I think is a component of the paramilitary army that is invading. They're stopped entirely.
Oh, the whole group.
And I think another group of about 200, as soon as they enter Guatemala, they are defeated by a garrison of about 30 Guatemala army officers. So the whole invasion is very ineffective. I think there is a sense, and we try to show this in the article, although I think here is where the information gets even scarcer. I think there is awareness in Washington, both within the media circles. For example, Drew Pearson clearly has very up-to-date information from the US ambassador. And there are a couple of encounters in which Robert Kennedy tells the CIA liaison to Congress, basically that the CIA better win this war that is going on in Guatemala. So it means that some information clearly is out there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there is a lot of concern because in the first few days, the operation is going really badly. I also found this document, and I am very cautious about how I present this document in the article, because it does look to me as if it was a full briefing that I imagine should have gone to leading members of Congress, because it provides certain information that anyone within the CIA or even the president would know, but leading members of Congress would not. And this briefing is basically both explaining and justifying what is going on in the country. What I don't know is who was briefed and whether this briefing actually took place. But we know from primary and secondary sources that at one point Eisenhower pretended to have to go back to Washington, I think, because he wanted to attend a Sunday mass or something. But the concern was that things in Guatemala might go so badly that Eisenhower needed to be present and to convince Congress to do something more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, ultimately, I know that despite the initial losses, they did successfully overthrow Arbenz. Was that just due to the air power that you mentioned earlier, or did those, these supported, group, this Castillo Armas group, did they kind of rally after those initial defeats, or was it just the air power?
No, they never really rallied from the initial defeat, and they weren't really able to do much. There was a key decision, a very famous decision, to bomb Guatemala City and to replace some of the P-47 planes that had been destroyed by Guatemalan forces. They were replaced by William Poley, who was one of the Eisenhower administration fixers in the region for several decades. And they were used to conduct bombings of Guatemala City and other areas. So that was really important. The radio that we mentioned earlier was perhaps the key component in convincing really the Guatemalan army that even if they had defeated this tiny invasion, a much bigger one was coming, and that they basically were confronting or ran the risk of confronting the United States. Now, at one point, Arbenz makes the decision that sort of he should try to give weapons also to unions and to popular militias to try and combat this invasion. Wow. But at one point, the army simply refuses in some of the outposts where this paramilitary invasion has entered the country. The army refuses to fight. And so when this happens, those people that had initially supported Arbenz in his view to arm these, let's say, popular militias, really go back on their word, because they think it would be one thing for the popular militia to fight this paramilitary invasion. It would be a different thing for the local militia to fight both the regular army and the paramilitary invasion. So it is basically at that point that Arbenz really surrenders.
Okay, I see. Yeah, things really fell apart for him in the end there. But yeah, it does not sound like it was like a sort of a tactical ground victory by any means.
No, it wasn't. And I think it was, even if it is considered a great success, it was really a close call, so much so that at some point there was consideration to do much more aggressive operations, including assassination. We covered assassinations quite extensively in my previous episode, but it does play a very prominent role, especially in the training manuals provided to the paramilitary force. The CIA compiles a list of people who would have to be killed after the Arbenz government is removed. According to a CIA internal history, nobody was ever actually killed, but the documents were released with all the names of the people on the list blacked out. So of course it's impossible to say whether any of them was actually killed.
Wow.
And something that I found quite interesting at the National Archives in Maryland was the fact that beyond these training materials, and beyond the fact that assassination is explicitly in the timetable of the groups being trained, you have assassination theory and practice sessions. There was also a lot of documents discussing the location, the residencies, and really the life pattern of Jacobo Arbenz himself. So one could imagine that he could have possibly been a victim of assassination, especially since at one point when the whole thing is going pretty badly, some officials within the CIA reflect with some of their contacts that maybe it might be a good idea to hire what they call some of Trujillo's pistoleros, meaning killers. So it was really a close call. And that is perhaps why it is somewhat surprising that it was considered very much a blueprint for future operations.
Wow. Incredible. I'm still shaking my head at that list of names. Like, you're not allowed to know who we were planning to kill, but we can assure you that none of them were actually killed.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's kind of self-defeating at that point.
Absolutely.
Goodness. So this ultimately the government was overthrown. Actually, I probably should have asked you this a few minutes ago, but there was this concern, like you said, of the hidden hand of Moscow behind everything. Did any of that turn out to be true? Was there a level of support coming from Moscow to Arbenz the entire time?
Not really. I think there was one of the key issues was that Arbenz had sort of legalized the Workers' Party in Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
His wife was probably a communist, and she was very well connected to this Workers' Party and to other communist intellectuals. In the aftermath of the invasion, the CIA launched another operation called the PB History, which was basically an effort to collect documents from the Arbenz era to basically demonstrate the extent of communist support, of the Soviet Union influence in the country, and so on. But what they found was really very, very little. According to some, basically the only thing that they found was that some Guatemalan officials had spent a grand total of $22.59 in a Moscow bookstore. So just to say, the USSR had no embassy in Guatemala at the time. So there wasn't this major communist threat.
Wow.
But of course, like Immerman, who's a great scholar of Guatemala, had suggested that at that time of the Cold War, the perception of the communist threat often far exceeded the actual communist threat, but this sort of did not make it less real for the people in charge, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, understandable. Wow. My goodness. I guess that's not super surprising, but it is unfortunate, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
So this operation, from CIA perspective, it played out very well. They achieved all of their objectives. Were they able to kind of repeat this process elsewhere afterwards? Was PBSUCCESS sort of like a template for later operations as well?
Well, it was certainly considered a blueprint for the Bay of Pigs operation, which, of course, we know that didn't particularly work.
Right.
But like some of the same people that were in charge of PBSUCCESS would be in charge of the Bay of Pigs. The idea of using a radio was also very much at the center of the Bay of Pigs operation. The use of aerial bombing, although in the case of the Bay of Pigs, it was clearly more explicitly done by the United States, was also present. And of course, the idea of training a small paramilitary force to launch an invasion was the same. I guess the paramilitary aspect of the two operations was equally successful as in entirely unsuccessful, both in the case of Guatemala and in the case of the Bay of Pigs. But it was considered certainly a template. And the idea was that in Iran, for example, there had been a broader involvement of other countries. In the case of Italy in 1948, there had been an extensive reliance on local allies, local parties, local groups. I think the case of Guatemala was seen as a particular success because basically the CIA had seemingly been able to remove a popular government and putting in charge somebody who was basically a political non-entity like Castillo Armas.
Right. Yeah, I know that he was not exactly a gifted leader, and he didn't even last that long, did he? I mean, he was overthrown himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And kickstarting a series of endless military coups, wars, and civil wars and internal revolutions, I guess.
Yeah, decades of instability followed PBSUCCESS, definitely. Very unfortunate for the country as a whole. So was this sort of balance of like the selective disclosures and media manipulation, that sort of thing, was CIA able to keep this up all the way through like the 70s, or did that, that kind of control over the narrative kind of deteriorate over time?
I think it did deteriorate over time, especially, I guess, the unchallenged or unquestioning support that the CIA received from the media certainly starts to diminish already in the 1960s with the Rampart scandal and the revelations about the CIA getting involved in the student movement and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But of course, it is really undermined by both, I guess, the deadly combination of Vietnam, Watergate, and the mid-1970s congressional initially media revelations and eventually congressional investigations of the behavior of the CIA.
Okay, yeah, it seemed all fall apart for them anyway after all of that. Is that when like intelligence oversight by Congress really came to fruition? Was after or during the Church Committee hearings, or were they already having like a greater measure of control before that?
I don't think there was a greater measure of control. There might have been a lot more skepticism, but there wasn't really a system of formal oversight before the late 1970s. One of the consequences of the Church Committee investigations, which turned 50 this year actually, was precisely the establishment of two committees, one in the House and one in the Senate, that would have the role of oversight of the intelligence community, and of course, through other legislative measures, through the system of presidential findings that would have to be presented to these committees of Congress before a covert operation can go underway. Of course, these committees never had the power to approve or disapprove or cancel a covert operation, but they could have found measures to ask the administration to amend their findings, amend covert operations, or in more radical cases, leak information about these operations to undermine them.
Okay, I see. Yeah, some disclosures of their own as a counteraction in a way. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, fascinating stuff, Luca. I really appreciate it. This article, like I said, it really opened my eyes to a lot of things, not just the PBSUCCESS, but how these decisions are made, through sort of a veil in a sense, in Congress and in the White House as well. It really is fascinating to see how that information kind of be squeezed and manipulated and given to exactly the right person at the right time to achieve the objective. So very interesting stuff. I'm curious, is your article, is it freely available online, the one that appeared in the journal?
I think it is.
I know you sent it to me as an attachment, of course. I didn't have a link for it. I'm going to have to look for it. If so, I'll post it up in the show notes if it is available online for the listeners who want to read more about it, because it is quite an extraordinary story and extremely well sourced as well. I think about a third of the article is your sources, which is always great for further in-depth reading as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah,
absolutely. So what are you working on now? I know this article came out a couple of years ago. So do you have another article or a book that you're working on at the moment?
Actually, I'm working on two things that are related in some way to PBSUCCESS. So one is an article about the last days of Ernesto Che Guevara in Bolivia. And I say it's connected to PBSUCCESS because Che Guevara was in Guatemala at the time of PBSUCCESS, and he witnessed the fall of Jacobo Arbenz, and it took some lessons for the Cuban government. And in particular, one of the key lessons that it took was that you cannot trust the army, because the army did surrender. And in fact, Fidel Castro did rely on a popular militia, which Jacobo Arbenz had tried but never implemented at the very last minute. And the second article that I'm working on with the same two co-authors of this piece on Guatemala is the continuation of our discussion of selective disclosures, looking at what happens to these disclosures and to the behavior of Congress in the context of covert operations, precisely in the era of more explicit oversight that we discussed earlier. In an article that we're hoping to publish soon, we look at the case of the Reagan administration's support for the Contras in Nicaragua, and we look at how basically the system of committees is almost a way of institutionalizing selective disclosures, in a sense that you have a set of people in Congress, those in the intelligence committees who are in the know, who know what is going on or think they know what is going on, and a whole set of people outside of Congress which might exercise various pressures on these committees to release more information.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, I would love to know how things change. Like you mentioned, it's in 30 years in the future, really, but some very similar objectives in the same region there. So that'd be a really interesting look at how things change and how some things.
And the final thing, I guess, which is very, very much in its early stages, with a colleague, Arturo Jimenez Bacardi of the National Security Archive, I'm hoping to submit a book proposal for a new book that would basically look at key covert operations during the Cold War through the lens of minutes of CIA meetings.
Huh. Oh, wow. See how it was all discussed there at the table at the top, so to speak? Okay.
Exactly.
Very cool. Yeah, I haven't read anything like that, so I would love to.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, well, thank you so much, Luca. Do you have a public website or social media pages or anything for people that want to follow along with you?
So I have my staff website of Swansea University that is I would say, regularly updated. I am no longer on X for obvious reasons. I am on Blue Sky now and on LinkedIn, where people can reach me. I kind of put on the back burner my Out of the Shadows podcast because I host a few episodes myself. So I'm doing your job every once in a while for the New Books Network. So I think these are the places where people can reach me. And of course, they can email me at my Swansea University address.
Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, I appreciate it. We will link that up then just if they want to take a look. And I look forward to what you're working on next because it sounds like exactly the kind of thing I love to read about no matter what.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me again.
Of course. Thank you. Take care, Luca. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.